Hi, everyone. In this video, I'll be going over the Adlerian Therapeutic Process. If you haven't already watched the Adlerian Approach Foundations video, I recommend you start there and then come on back here. All right, please note that this video is going to go in a little bit of a different order compared to the other process videos because it will operate off of the Adlerian phases of therapy. So I'm going to begin with explaining conceptualization, as you see on this slide, and goals of therapy. And then I will go through each of the 4 phases instead of splitting it like I normally do. So conceptualization. One of the reasons why Adlerian therapists believe symptoms arise is because a client is struggling to meet one or more of the universal life tasks. And Adler taught that we must master 3 universal life tasks in order to be psychologically healthy and fulfilled. First is the social task, which has to do with building friendships. Then is the love and marriage task, which has to do with establishing intimacy. And then finally, the occupational task, which involves contributing to society. So impairment in any one of these life tasks is often an indicator of a psychological disorder. And most often when people seek therapy, it's because they're struggling unsuccessfully to meet one or more of these life tasks. And symptoms also arise from the presence of core fears. Okay. So basically, when we are working with clients, we're going to operate off of this assumption that there is some issue with their life tasks and some issue perhaps with their core fears. And so this is going to influence our goals of therapy. So the aim of therapy is to help the client to develop social interests and modify their lifestyle so they can more effectively navigate each of the life tasks. This involves reframing attitudes, beliefs, and lifestyle choices that are blocking success. It also involves helping to build self-confidence in the client and reduce feelings of inferiority. Therapy then consists of 4 phases. Engagement, which has to do with creating a collaborative therapist-client relationship. Assessment, which involves gathering information about the client's personal history with a special emphasis on birth order and early childhood. Insight, which involves the therapist helping the client learn how to view their situation from a different perspective. And reorientation, which involves reinforcing newly discovered insights and continuing to learn about oneself through the implementation of therapist-suggested steps to take outside of therapy. I'm going to go into each of these in more detail. First phase, engagement, and this can be thought of as the therapist's role, which we normally would go over. So in order to create engagement, the therapist-client relationship is one that is cooperative, trusting, respectful, and aligned. It is seen as a relationship between equals. Both the therapist and the client should be working equally towards specific agreed upon goals. The relationship should focus on the person-to-person contact rather than the problem. Without this relationship, therapeutic efficacy in later stages will be compromised. So to support engagement, the therapist should look for major mistakes in thinking and valuing. They should identify and explore core fears like being imperfect, being vulnerable, being disapproved of, or suffering from past regrets. They should model communication and acting in good faith, and they should help clients to become aware of their assets and strengths. Phase 2 has to do with assessment, and there are a couple of different strategies here. First is the subjective interview. So Adlerians often begin with a structured interview where they obtain information about the family constellation, early recollections, life goals, and childhood experiences. This interview involves helping the client tell their story, their life story, as completely as possible. In the interview, the therapist should extract patterns about the person's life, or in the person's life. So this would allow the development of hypotheses about what works for this person and determine what accounts for their concerns or what doesn't work for this person. An interview like this requires a generous use of empathic listening and responding. The therapist must respond with a sense of wonder, fascination, interest, curiosity that encourages the client to share more and naturally leads the therapist to ask more specific questions and inquiries that will give more detail about the client's life story. The therapist at this point should be treating the client as the expert in their lives, allowing them to feel completely heard. Because remember that in this approach, the therapist and client are equals, but when it comes to the client's life, the client is the expert. The subjective interview would normally end by asking, how would your life be different and what would you be doing differently if you did not have this symptom or problem? Most often, the symptoms the client endorses help the client to avoid something that's perceived as necessary, i.e. one of the universal life tasks, but from which the client wishes to retreat. For example, a response to this question might be, if it weren't for my depression, I would get out more and see my friends. This may indicate concern about being a good friend and being accepted by friends. And so the depression, in a sense, is keeping the client from taking the risk of being seen as a bad friend. Next is the objective interview. And the objective interview aims to gather information about all of these things here. So how did the problem begin? What are the precipitating events, medical history, social history, and so on. Much of this information you would gather when completing a psychosocial history. You'd definitely gather the first 5 here in a DMH initial assessment, for example. The last one, though, is unique to Adlerian therapy, and I'm going to go into more depth on the lifestyle assessment now. So completion of a lifestyle assessment involves gathering information about the person's style of living based on a questionnaire about the client's family constellation. This assessment gives the therapist a perspective on the client's major areas of success and failure throughout their life, as well as how the client pursues life goals and any critical influences that have had a bearing on the role the client has assumed in the world. So things like culture, social environment, political information or affiliation, family environment, and so on. The lifestyle assessment also includes a birth order assessment. Adler suggested that the psychological situation of each child in the home is different from that of others based on the birth order. Now, although birth order is not deterministic, it does increase the likelihood of having a certain set of experiences, and this is what the Adlerian therapist is looking for. Further, what's most important is the individual's interpretation of their experience as an only child or as a second child or what have you. So this is why not all second-born children, for example, will experience this in the same way. For example, a second-born might experience the family from the psychological position of the youngest if there happened to be a 10-year gap before the next child was born. Okay? And so you need to find out what the client's experience of this was. And then this chart here gives you some information about common characteristics based on birth order. Your textbook also provides a lot of additional detail of what you might see based on birth order. But please be sure not to assume that this is fact. You need to assess and find out what the client's experience was, and then you could use that experience to see kind of where they landed perhaps in terms of their position. The lifestyle, before I go there, another thing that you could do to begin to explore birth order is this activity here. And basically the instructions are to have the client rate each of their siblings and themselves from highest to lowest on each of the personality dimensions. This could then serve as a springboard for deeper assessment if you're wanting to find out more information. Okay, another part of the lifestyle assessment is assessing early recollections. And early recollections are stories of events that a person says occurred before they were 10 years old. Note that it's important that it says they said it occurred, meaning that it doesn't necessarily have to have occurred or have to have occurred in the way they said, because what matters is how they experienced it, okay? And so we find out about these stories and assess the feelings and thoughts associated with each of these recollections. The point here is that the recollections that a client selects tend to project their essential convictions and perhaps even some of the basic mistakes of their lives. We tend to select recollections that reflect how we believe, how we behave now, and what we anticipate for the future. So by listening to the stories that our client tells us, the therapist is able to define major successes and mistakes in the client's life and learn a little bit about how the client acts and behaves and how they think, both in healthy and unhealthy ways. Once you've heard these stories, you would engage in an interpretation of these early recollections. So a prompt you could use in therapy to begin to explore early recollections would be to start off with a question like, I would like to hear about your early memories. Think back to when you were young, as early as you can remember, and tell me something that happened. be sure to recall something that you remember, not something that you were told by others. You would then listen to the memory and ask any probing questions, such as the ones listed on this slide. Then elicit at least 2 more early recollections. From there, you can interpret the memories by attempting to identify patterns across all of the recollections and to identify certain basic mistakes or behavioral patterns that the client is engaging in, or thoughts that the client is consistently using, which may be indicative of their lifestyle. Okay. In phase 3, the therapist is interpreting the findings of the assessment from phase 2 in order to help the client increase self-understanding and insight. This involves understanding the motivations that drive a client's behavior. Note, however, that insight without action is not seen as helpful according to Adler. So insight is seen as a means to an end. Adlerian interpretations should be presented as open-ended questions that can then be explored in session. So they're offered as potential hypotheses, not as definitive explanations. So you would preface them with something like, is it possible that, and then offer your interpretation. Or, I could be wrong, but I'm wondering if, and then offer your interpretation. Then the discussion that you have with the client about it, whether it be right or wrong according to the client, can be helpful in building insight, whether or not it's right or wrong, because it's going to encourage the client to deeply explore the reasons and motivations behind what they do and think. Okay, in stage 4, which is the final stage, we have reorientation and re-education. This is the action-oriented phase that involves putting new insights into practice. So clients are supported in developing the courage to try new things and adopt a new style of life based on what they learned, instead of repeating the unsuccessful patterns of behavior. More often, clients learn how to reorient their current style of living to the useful side of life by shifting their interactional style, process, and motivation toward a sense of belonging and being valued, toward having interest in others, toward accepting imperfection, toward wanting to contribute to the greater good, and toward becoming outgoing and friendly. Having an attitude of encouragement is helpful in this process because it helps clients to become aware of their strengths and resources, times when they feel like they belong, and times when they have hope, which promotes social interest. To encourage clients, Adlerian therapists can use techniques from various other approaches to help clients identify and challenge self-defeating cognition, so something from CBT, for example, and make use of their assets and strengths in a strengths-based approach. It can also be helpful to reframe challenging situations by highlighting the resilience that the client exhibited. Here are some other strategies that could be helpful during this stage. First, catching yourself. So catching yourself involves teaching clients to become attentive to situations in which they're performing behaviors they want to change. By catching themselves repeating old patterns, clients can begin to gain insight and to consciously make concrete changes. The push button technique also helps clients to become aware of their role in contributing to unpleasant feelings. They are asked to recreate an unpleasant memory and become aware of the feelings connected to it. Then they are asked to recall a pleasant memory and become aware of the feelings connected to it. By showing them how quickly they can shift from negative to positive, clients are helped to see that they can create whatever feeling they want just by thinking about it. This helps clients to regain a sense of control over their negative feelings that may seem overwhelming. They can also be given an actual physical push button or something like it to carry around as a physical reminder of their control over their feelings and thoughts. Now we'll evaluate really briefly. So some strengths. The holistic and systemic approach that Adlerian therapists use considers the internal and external influences upon a person, rather than viewing a person as existing in a vacuum. Also, its emphasis on person-to-person relationships allows for the use of different techniques and strategies as opposed to limiting you to only the ones that are in your text, for example. Limitations. Unless well-trained, therapists can make mistakes when interpreting, but remember that if these are made as suggestions as they should be, they can still be used to further the therapy process. Finally, this approach needs more empirical evidence, but it's difficult to gather since these techniques are somewhat vague in general. So that's it for the Adlerian approach to therapy. Let me know if there's anything I can clarify or if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.